on 2016 local election results. What I want to do in about 10 or so minutes is to sort of briefly at a high level, first start with a snapshot both of 2016 election results, as well as looking at previous election cycles just for some potential compare and contrast opportunities. Take a look at the current partisan breakdown of mayors across the country, both before and after 2016 elections. Look specifically at a list of the top 10 local races to watch, compiled by Ballotpedia before the election, and provide a little bit of background and context there to see how those races shook out. And then finally, end with some thoughts on local ballot measures, and turn it over to Q&A, where hopefully you either be able to answer your questions or at least direct you to some helpful Ballotpedia resources on the topics. So taking a look at the snapshot, looking at 2014 by way of comparison, concerning the 100 largest cities in the country, 43 held elections. 21 of those were mayoral elections. None of those offices actually flipped partisan control. Concerning incumbency rates, 13 incumbents ran, 2 lost re-election. Number of fresh faces, how many people were new to these local elections? How many people were new to these local offices after the fact? About 11, because of a combination of some incumbency losses and a number of open seats. So contrasting that with 2016, concerning the top 100 largest cities in the country, 46 of them held elections. And unlike 2014 with 21 mayoral elections, there were 24 mayoral and city council elections this year being covered. And there were partisan flips. There was a Democratic seat that went to Republicans, one office of unknown partisan affiliation, a seat that is formally nonpartisan, but the affiliation of the person not known to us ultimately went to Republican, one Republican to Democrat. By the way, specifically, those were Nelda Martinez, a Democrat who defeated Dan McQueen, a Republican in the Corpus Christi, Texas race. The unknown was John Lewis, who ran against Jen Daniels, a Republican in Gilbert, Arizona. And finally, a race that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, the Stockton mayoral race, the incumbent Anthony Silva, Republican, defeated by Democrat Michael Tubbs. Incumbency rates just a little different. 15 incumbents running, 1 lost in an earlier race in June, 3 lost in November. In terms of fresh faces, about the same, 10 new to the offices, again, for a combination of some incumbency losses and open seats. Turning to the before and after 2016 November election partisan breakdown, what's clear in both cases is that Democrats hold the majority of mayoral seats across the top 100 cities in the country. This is an interesting contrast to the national, even state stories. Of course, the Republicans will be taking the White House as well as maintaining both seats of Congress. They hold a majority of positions in the states, state legislative houses, governorships. But when it comes to the top 100 mayoral positions, the Democrats hold majorities. Prior to the election, 67% to the Republicans, 27%, with a small sliver of some of unknown nonpartisan affiliation as well as independents. After the election, Democrats held on to that 67% majority, Republicans gaining a percentage point up to 28, again with a small sliver for unknowns. Number of interesting things happened, by the way, not just in mayoral elections as well. Well, I should actually say before I jump onto that, just to sort of break this down a little bit, provide a little bit more context to these maps. In 2016 altogether, there were 25 mayorships up for election. And of the mayors currently still serving in these positions, 12 are Republican, 11 Democrat, 1 nonpartisan, 1 of unknown affiliation. Now, concerning these particular positions, considering the whole pie of the top 100 mayor races, the 12 Republicans represent about 44% of all Republican mayors. The 11 Democratic represent about 16%. So going into this election, although the Democrats hold the majority of the top 100 mayor positions, it's really, proportionately speaking, the Democrats that, or the Republicans actually, that were in the position to actually defend the seats, because if they'd lost many, that would have been a significant proportion of the ultimate ones they hold out of the total pie of the top 100. As it turns out, they actually gained a percentage point. I was going to say there's some other interesting sorts of things that have changed, although there wasn't much changing in the mayoral race. Some notable races that I won't get into later, but one thing that's emerging is that, for instance, city council election in San Francisco, turns out that we might be actually seeing a move from a more progressive potential coalition of council members to a more moderate one. An interesting trend, to be sure to return back to Ballotpedia often to sort of keep up updates about that. Okay, turning now to the top 10 races to watch in the municipal elections this year. California, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Texas, Louisiana, New Jersey, Florida. These are the top 10 races chosen for a number of different reasons concerning a number of different sorts of positions: mayor races, city council races, sheriff races, school board races, even some local ballot initiatives. Chosen for a number of reasons: competitiveness in certain cases, the media attention they were garnering, or others, and just the implications for future governance. Like I said, with the San Francisco City Council, it'll be interesting to sort of see the implications of a potential a shift in the coalition in those seats. So taking a look at the first top race on our list, Travis County Sheriff, immigration was a main issue in this race, as it was in a number of local races we'll be touching on, as it was in a number of state and national races this year. The Democrat incumbent Greg Hamilton, who had taken office in 2004, decided not to run again. Interestingly, Travis County, from around the period 2009 to 2014, had been deporting about approximately 19 people per week. Potentially one reason why immigration had become a big issue in this race. One of the candidates who ultimately lost had basically said that what they'd planned to do was to continue the former sheriff's plans and sort of the coordination and cooperation with the various custom immigration agencies. The candidate Hernandez, who ultimately won, she wanted to sort of strike a different path and sort of said, quote, "I want to redefine Travis County's relationship with the custom immigration agencies." Ultimately, she prevailed. Number 9 on the list concerned a number of different elections in Jersey City, Jersey. Specifically, Jersey City school boards. There were a number of different slates running. There was a slate called the Education Matters slate, and they expressed desires to shorten board meetings, build consensus between school leaders, local politicians, improve public school curriculum infrastructure. That same slate was actually used successfully by candidates in an election last year. A different slate, the Jersey City United, argued for commitment to diversity, increased responsiveness to community demands, modernization of communications between school district and district parents. A final slate, the Fix It Now, proposed things like multilingual accessibility, held some moderate support for charter schools, mentor programs, various things, and wanted to build close relationship between the Board of Education and state and local officials. Ultimately, 2 Education Matters slate candidates won, and more than half of the board members, it's interesting to note, were actually backed by Jersey City Mayor. Number 8 on our list of top 10 races, the Los Banos School District race in California. What's notable about this was that about 2 weeks after the candidate filing deadline for the race closed, the trusty Area 2 incumbent and actually former Mayor Tommy Jones was arrested on bribery charges related to things concerning construction contracts for the district. He maintained his innocence, refused to step down. This prompted the school board to call a special meeting to censure Jones in September. Well, this action helped essentially split the race for these 3 open school board seats into 2 camps, those supported by teachers' unions, those supported by a local advocacy group, the Community Advocacy Coalition. As it turns out, Going Soares, who challenged Jones, ultimately prevailed in the race. Number 7 on the list is another school board district race, this one in Clark County, Nevada. Clark County, you may or may not know, is actually the nation's 5th largest school district. And it obtained this year special legislative approval to undertake a massive restructuring. Basically calls for each school to become its own district, with the principal acting as primary decision makers on issues from budget, personnel, salary, etc. There's some controversy about this, despite support from lawmakers, principals, various teachers unions. There was concern from others in the community, including groups like the ACLU and the Clark County School Board, about what ramifications there might be for students because of this reorganization. In any event, it brought out a lot of competition. The redistricting plan drew higher than average participation, with about 4.3 candidates per seat for just 4 seats up for election. As it turns out, 3 of 4 incumbents on the previous board ultimately retained their seats. Number 6, the mayor and city council races in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Um, Baton Rouge Metro Council going into the race had 7 Republican members and 5 Democratic members. 3 of these Republican members retired. Um, so this was an interesting race to watch because this was the ultimate partisan breakdown after the election was uncertain. It's the sort of race where if there's no candidate winning the outright majority, the top 2 go to a runoff election that'll be held December 10th. Every incumbent, as it turned out, advanced to that runoff. Law enforcement, crime, racial tensions, these were major issues in these races in Baton Rouge, particularly following the fatal shooting of Alton Sterling, the murder of 3 police officers by Gavin Long in July. It made national news. Sterling's death led to protests by local activists. Interestingly, in Baton Rouge, I mean, this all takes place in the context of what had been a almost 16% decline in the city's overall crime rate from 2010. Returning to the Stockton race, which I mentioned earlier. Crime, also an issue in this race, but so was post-bankruptcy plans. In about 2012, the city had to declare bankruptcy because of a number of years of dropping tax revenues, growing budget concerns. City budget cuts, for instance, had affected public safety departments, which some have argued is what's led to a more recent spike in crime violent rates in that city as well. The local elections in Stockton are formally nonpartisan, but Mayor Anthony Sylvia essentially identifies as a Republican, and challenger Michael Tubbs identifies as a Democrat. Ultimately, Tubbs won, and won comfortably. So turning to something a little different, a local ballot measure in Los Angeles, the Build Better LA initiative. Concern largely things like affordable housing, local labor issues. A yes vote on this measure, which ultimately prevailed, means requiring developments of certain sizes to incorporate affordable housing, encourage developers to use local workers, pay standard wages, various things, including members from training apprentice programs. And no vote effectively just would have rejected the initiative. Some key provisions mean that all development projects in this area that include 10, for instance, 10 or more residential units are going to require the developers to include a number of units for low sort of affordable housing for low income working renters. For instance, developers are also going to have to hire contract workers, pay standard wages, employ members of apprentice training programs. Developers would be required to make as much as 20% of these units for affordable housing. The supporters argue that no tax dollars will be used in this. Opponents, on the other hand, had argued that instead of affordable housing, what it might just end up meaning is lots of sky rises and dense development use downtown where it may not be needed. Others argued that it might ironically harm development altogether. Number 3 on the list, the Pinellas Schools Board District in Florida. So Pinellas School Board notable because it's been under critical examination, largely because of a report published in 2015 entitled Failure Factory, looked at a 2007 board decision that in many people's eyes effectively segregated the district schools. The report has triggered a sort of a still in progress civil rights investigation by the U.S. Department of Education. The report, Failure Factories, actually went on to win a 2017 Pulitzer Prize in local reporting. 3 of the board members who voted for this deintegration plan still sat on the board as of the 2016 election: Peggy O'Shea, Linda Learn, or Carol Cook. Incumbents had actually been reelected. These incumbents have been reelected a number of times. In fact, between the period of 1998 and 2014, there'd been a 100% incumbency success rate in this district. Although Cook, by the way, was the top vote recipient in the primary election, she didn't receive enough to win outright, which is why in November she ultimately faced Alicio Santana in the general election. Cook retained her seat, and as it turns out, one of two newcomers finally won an at-large seat. Number 2 on the list was a sheriff race, Maricopa County. This involved the Republican Joe Arpaio, outspoken, controversial national figure, a number of tough stances on immigration and various other issues. Many analysts predicted that this was going to be his toughest re-election bid yet, and as it turns out, he was ultimately unsuccessful, losing to Democrat Paul Tanzone. Interesting to note that Arpaio for this local sheriff race had actually raised over $12 million. And to put that in perspective, Governor Ducey, who became governor of Arizona in 2014, had only raised $8 million for the statewide race. Finally, number one on the list of the top 10 local races to watch was Detroit Public Schools district. So what was interesting about Detroit Public Schools is that in 2009, the school district had actually been placed under the supervision of a state-appointed emergency manager with an 11-member school board district. So this race was about finding 7 members to ultimately, once it takes effect next year, to replace that emergency board and those 11 board members. That actually brought out 63 different candidates, including 10 of the 11 former board members on the state-appointed emergency manager board. 3 candidates running on what was called the 5 for the Future slate, ultimately won a number of the 7 seats. Only 1 member from the old board ultimately prevailed and will appear in the new board in 2017. So finally, it'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, although we mentioned a few of them before, a lot of the local ballot measure races across the country. Notable for a number of different reasons, including issues that we saw not just in other local ballot measures, but statewide ballot measures and issues even at a federal level. Ballotpedia, for instance, tracked 630 local measures in California alone. Some of these included things like marijuana issues, a notable issue about DC statehood. Just to say a little bit about both briefly, Douglas County, Oregon, for instance, where there was a ballot measure concerning marijuana. Again, marijuana was a fairly well-covered topic this year and was on a number of ballot measures. This one specifically asked whether or not to allow medical and recreation marijuana retail outlets in unincorporated areas of the county. So supporters said that the county was the perfect area to develop this industry, be a boon for the local economy. Interestingly, in addition to other concerns about marijuana generally, some opponents had argued that, well, hey, the incorporated areas of Douglas County are perfectly suited for this as well. One final noteworthy ballot measure actually concerns statehood in Washington, D.C. This is something that D.C. activists have from time to time tried to press and to try to get on the ballot in a number of different ways. There was basically a question. A yes vote would advise the DC City Council to approve a proposal plan for statehood. It wouldn't have any legally binding effect. It wouldn't have made DC a state. It would have simply sort of asked the DC Council to then put together and approve a proposal to then ultimately request for statehood. One really notable thing was that it actually included language about what the state would ultimately be called. It wouldn't be called Washington, DC anymore. It would be called New Columbia. It was ultimately won by a fairly wide margin and had a lot of interesting support, including from the DC mayor and Hillary Clinton, who endorsed the campaign. So with that, I will turn it back over to Kayla and to you for any comments and questions. And thank you for listening. And like I said, hopefully we'll be able to answer. If not, we'll be able to direct you to existing resources on Ballotpedia.
Cool. Thank you so much, Chris. If anyone has any questions, there's both a Q&A tool and then the chat that you can use to send us those. But I want to start us off with something I've been wondering about. At least with among these 10 notable races, 2 of them dealt with immigration, and the ultimate winners wanted to take a different approach towards immigration than has been advocated at the winner of the presidential election.
It's an interesting question, and I might turn it over to some of my colleagues on the call. But in the meantime, I think one thing to note, one thing to highlight. I think when you look at, for instance, those partisan breakdowns that we put up, it's a really interesting thing about local races is the fact that while again on the national and a majority of state level races now we have, for instance, members of the Republican Party at the top 100 city level. We have a majority of Democrats. And I just think that's an interesting thing to point out. So I think there's going to be, a difference of vision there, just, across a range of issues. But I think that's sort of just another way of sort of highlighting just the unique difference that sort of understanding that sort of local races presents, which is that there really is a different sort of partisan makeup. Daniel, any thoughts to add?
Certainly. So the main thing I'd point out, in addition to what Chris mentioned, which is that although Democrats have recently struggled on the state, now the federal level electorally, they've been very successful on the municipal level. We're talking about very different electorates. with the presidential election, of course, that's a national election. Here we're specifically talking about Maricopa County, Arizona, and Travis County, Texas. And it's no surprise that you would have different electorates then. And since you have a different electorate, it can lead to a different outcome on the same policy issues. Another thing to note here is that in these sheriff's races, these are the top issue when you're thinking about sheriff for a large portion of the electorate. Whereas in a presidential election, you have dozens and hundreds of issues that are very important to various people. And so that is also a major difference in what could produce a different outcome on the local versus the national level. Is you have essentially, if not a single issue race, one of maybe a half dozen issues in this race, in the sheriff's level race, versus a dramatically more varied set of issues on the national level.
Cool, thank you. While we're waiting to see if there are any more questions that pop up, I just want to let everyone know that they can send us questions later. They can email us, editor@ballotpedia.org. We're on Twitter @ballotpedia, and then facebook.com/ballotpedia. Cool. Otherwise, it looks like our panelists don't have any other races that they want to talk about, and there aren't any other questions. So I think we can go ahead and end our session today. So I want to thank you everyone so much for joining us. We'll be emailing out a recording of this, and it will be available on YouTube later. And thank you so much, and have a nice day.